Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Today I have part 2 of the White Van Man series written by Luke Hemingway. And again, this is more of a true life horror story, though it is fiction, kind of along the lines of a episode of Law and Order SVU. So if you are sensitive to things like that and things involving children, this is your warning. Now, it's time to get cozy, get comfortable, because it's about to get creepy. The White Van Man, Part 2, by Luke Hemingway. Ultimately, by the time the end of my last day of my school year rolled around 8 days later, I had pretty much began to move on with my life, and the whole thing was becoming to be a creepy tale that maybe I could share one day as an antidote among friends while sitting around a campfire or at a table in a bar. On this particular day, my mom was still on her 12 to 12 shift at the hospital, and my dad was working away again out of town. Again, I'm sure a lot of people may read this and picture me as some poor, neglected kid with two parents more concerned about their careers and after-work drinks with colleagues. That couldn't be further from the truth. My parents taught me to be independent from an early age, and I was always trusted to look after myself. This allowed my parents to go do what they needed to do to make sure I had everything I needed. Up until this event and the insane roller coaster that followed, I always felt I had a great upbringing, and I'm so grateful for both my parents. As it was a Friday and the holidays had begun, my mom said my friend, who we will call Jessica, could stay over. Jessica and I left school that day after saying goodbye to our classmates for 6 whole weeks. We didn't take the usual route home, however. You see, one of our other friends was being picked up by her mom, and being the kind woman she was, she offered us a ride. They lived on the street behind our house, and there happened to be a small convenient footpath through the trees in between the adjoining gardens that we could easily cut across to my backyard. It was raining, and we didn't fancy waiting for the pretty unreliable school bus in the cold. This meant also that we could be home in 10 minutes rather than 60. Also, me, Jess, and our friend Daisy could finalize our plans for us 3 meeting up over the summer holidays in a comfortable and warm Audi Q5. We obviously snatched up the offer. We entered my house through the back porch via my sliding patio doors and started the usual girly sleepover stuff you did at that age. We raided the cupboards for crisps and sweets to take up to my room for a movie marathon of Mean Girls, Angus Thongs, and John Tucker Must Die. I remember every detail from that night, for better or worse. The hours flew by, and I was honestly enjoying our time together, watching movies whilst talking to our crushes on MSN and leaving sassy comments on our crushes' MySpace. We were living the preteen dream. It had gotten to around 10 p.m., and the sun was now down on our quiet suburban community and settled under a warm, dark blanket of summer night. We looked down to find our snack bowls were empty. I said I would go and get us more cheesy Doritos and sweet and salty popcorn. Be a good host and all. However, Jessica, being the bubbly sprite that she was, said she would go get them. She needed to use the bathroom anyway. She insisted. I should note that our upstairs toilet had the tendency to stab you in the back when it came to flushing. I don't imagine she wanted to risk the embarrassment, and the mix of sugar-rich fizzy drinks and processed salty snacks had clearly taken its toll on her stomach. I didn't make things weird for her and gladly handed her my bowl. She hopped off the bed and walked to the doorway and turned sharply to the right and made her way down the hall. However, just before she stepped out of sight behind where the bedroom door hinges fixed to the landing wall, Jessica paused for a half-second to look back at me. She gave me a smile. I'm not entirely sure what the motivation behind it was, but it was a warm one. I reciprocated. I think we just share a strong bond of closeness, and we were both feeling the euphoria at the fact the school holidays had begun. Two 13-year-olds with the house to themselves with 6 weeks of school-free summertime ahead. Everything going for us and everything to look forward to. Who wouldn't want to crack a smile? We weren't the most popular kids by any stretch, but that didn't matter. Not to us. We had each other and a few other close friends. Our circle was certainly small, but that was more than enough for us. Me and Jessica in particular were especially close. She was more like a sister to me. We had been friends since I can remember my first memory. She was loyal to the core as I was to her. We were inseparable, and people often mistook us for the other. We had always looked alike, and due to being so close, we tended to wear similar clothes and have our hair done the same way. Almost like twins. In fact, I think it was only a few weeks before this event took place I started doing my hair in pigtails to at least try to stand out from Jessica, but it was useless. Other than her being a little bigger than me, we were pretty much identical. Jessica's warm smile remained on her face until she moved out of sight and proceeded to make her way downstairs. Once she'd left my sight, I convinced myself to scooch down to the bottom of my bed from the comfy position I was in, all relaxed in the nest we'd made for ourselves from my pillows, duvet, and the corner of my room where my wall met my headboard. I guess pausing the film seemed the least I could do for Jessica, seeing as she was grabbing the snacks and everything. The remote was sat on my bedroom windowsill, which was situated upside the space between the foot of my bed and the TV in the corner of my room. My vision locked onto the item as I shimmied on my butt down the bed. I grabbed the remote, paused the movie, turned to replace it, and as I lifted my head and broke eye lock with the remote for the first time, and that's when I saw it. The top 30 centimeters of a white Ford Transit van. Discreet and innocuous, yet all the while unmistakable and nefarious. I once again attempted my previous trick and began closing my eyes tightly and rubbing them with my fingers in a desperate attempt to wake myself up from what now seemed like a reoccurring nightmare. I put everything into the process, including a little prayer that I was dreaming for good measure, hoping that this yielded the same results as it had done earlier in the week. But this time, no matter how many times I repeated this, it never worked. Every time I unclenched my eyes, I could still just make out the top of that Ford Transit white van from just over my neighbor's garden hedge. This was getting real. I felt my breathing increase. Oh crap, no way. I whimpered in disbelief. I was frozen in a state of denial and rationalization, trying to fight off the surge of pure terror that was threatening to erupt from within me. The realization hit me in the face like a bat, that if in fact this was the van, the same van from last week, then Dave would not be far away. I tried desperately to convince myself this was just another van, desperately looking for differences in size, color, or shape, but I couldn't. It was the same make, the same model, and I knew by the way it was parked. Exactly how it was that day Dave had jumped inside it to make his getaway. Parked just around the left corner to the entrance of my cul-de-sac. What was hitting me now was an unwanted case of deja vu. I was looking on in shock when the van, as if sensing I'd noticed it, suddenly burst to life. The engine fired and began to tick over, and its headlights unleashed their rays like a sleeping animal being awoken. Then, to my horror, it began to creep slowly around the corner and made its way onto my street. My eyes wouldn't look away. I watched it pull up directly in the middle of my cul-de-sac, side door aimed at the front of my house, lined up almost perfectly with the symbol at the bottom of the drive. Red flag number 1. I looked for the license plate. There wasn't one. Red flag number 2. The side door of the van snapped out of the closed position, and the door slid backwards approximately 10 inches, revealing a preview of the dark abyss from within the vehicle. Then, from that very abyss, I noticed the third and final red flag. A black-gloved hand protruded from the darkness to place its palm on the edge of the door and began to carefully, as if not wanting to make too much noise, slide it open further. This made me snap out of my daze for the first time, and my senses came back to me. I needed to get down and make sure the doors were locked, as I could not remember if me and Jessica had locked the patio doors behind us when we came in the back porch. Jesus, we had been so busy laughing and giggling about school and other stuff that maybe we'd forgot. I needed to get her upstairs, barricade my room, and call my mom. I was just inhaling enough air into my already pulsating lungs so I could shout her name loud enough for her to hear me when I heard a noise. I honestly couldn't tell you what it was specifically. A simple, loud, sharp bang, followed by a series of slightly quieter, dull sounds. My blood had turned to pure ice. I could not comprehend the fear and terror that I was feeling right then. I had spent the last 8 days suppressing that horrific feeling when the man I knew as Dave showed me his knife, but now it was back, worse than ever. I knew this wasn't good. I crept down the hallway to the beginning of my landing, where the stairs met the upstairs hallway and the wall opposite my bedroom turns to a wooden banister. This allowed me to peek at a section of my downstairs area. I held my breath long enough so I could concentrate on trying to hear. There were no more noises, no loud bangs, just silence. Horrible, deafening silence. The only noise I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat pounding away in my eardrums. "Jessica?" I managed to whimper, taking another 2 baby steps forward to increase my vantage point. This revealed my front door, ajar, with the chain hanging free. A jagged piece of the door frame swung on from its limp end. "Jess?" My voice now broke in a desperate prayer for her to answer me back. Nothing was coming back to me, though. That's when I saw the soiled boot prints heading into the kitchen, leading to half a bowl of cheesy Doritos spread all over the floor, most of them crushed as if they'd been trampled on. The boot prints led in from the front door into the kitchen where the mess could be seen, and then they retreated back out of the house. I looked around, and the scene began to register in my mind and play out like a Crime Watch reconstruction video. I pictured the door being kicked open, the chain breaking. I then saw a man with fresh mud from our front garden make his way into our house, leaving the footprints as he entered and left. I imagined Jessica dropping the bowl of chips after being startled by the door being bust open, the Doritos spilling on the kitchen floor. Finally, it was the image of the man grabbing Jessica and placing his gloved hand over her mouth and dragging her out my front door that made me realize there and then my best friend was gone. I was frozen, trying once again, pathetically, to wake myself up. This couldn't be real. Things like this don't happen to people like me. I'm just a normal kid. These were the thoughts flying through my brain. Cliché, I know, but when an event like this happens, I can tell you now, it really is something that you can't get your head around. It seemed like hours had passed, but was probably only really 90 seconds before I eventually accepted what had happened and told myself I had to act fast. I ran back to my room to get my phone, toes slipping off the end of every other step as I frantically tried to get to a place of safety. As I'm trying to dial my mom's number, fighting the uncontrollable shakes in my nerves and trying to ride the overwhelming surge of adrenaline, I look out my window. The van is now gone. I sat in my room with the door shut and my chest of drawers pulled alongside the wall to act as a deadlock on my door, and sat with my back against it, feet against my bed for leverage. Nothing was coming in while I had anything to do with it. My mom had instructed me to stay put and to keep safe, while she would call the people who needed to be called. She promised me she would be there soon and everything was going to be okay. I couldn't tell over the phone if she really believed that. My dad, the police, and Jessica's parents were all notified by my mom as I sat hyperventilating in the middle of my room, eyes locked on the barricaded door. Jessica's mom knew all about my mom's working hours and knew that me and her would be home alone that night. She was fine with it, as both our moms knew how mature we were for our ages. But even so, I don't know how my mom managed to break the news that a man had come in the middle of the night and taken her only child. The police arrived first. Through my bedroom door, an officer addressed himself. "Olivia Matthews, my name is Detective Paul McKinley." "I'm from the police department. We've had a call from your mom about your friend. Can you come out, please?" I didn't trust him right away. I asked him to prove who he was, which he gladly obliged, and responded by telling me my mom's name and what she did for a living. He also advised me to take a look outside my window. I had pulled my wardrobe across my window frame for extra security, so I did not notice the flashing blue lights of the police response team right outside my house. I took this as validation that he was, in fact, a policeman and not the man coming back for me and conning his way into my bedroom. I spent the next 15 minutes being comforted by Detective McKinley downstairs on the couch until my mom and Jessica's parents got there. They arrived at almost the same time, with my dad arriving 30 minutes later. He had abruptly left his worksite as soon as he'd heard from my mom. Jessica's mom, Jesus, she looked broken. She had always been a very bubbly person, just like her daughter, and she was kind of like one of the girls in a lot of ways. I always enjoyed her company anyway. I imagined if this night had never happened, then she would have been the type of mom who would have taken us both out for brunch to talk about men and gossip when we reached our later teens. But I knew from the minute she walked through my front door on that night that the woman would never be the same again. The sheer agony on her face from her panic and threat over her daughter's fate was enough to make me want to vomit. I honestly didn't recognize her. The detective wanted my mom to be present before I gave my statement. I guessed it was a combination of protocol and wanting to keep me calm to give an accurate account of the night's events. My mom was sat with her arm round me, telling me it was okay and to tell them what happened, encouraging me that anything that I can remember at all, it would be useful. I really didn't know where to begin. So I took a moment, took a deep breath, and told the detective, I know who did this. I know who's got Jessica. This made Jessica's mom snap out of her pale, shaking daze and made her eyes explode open. She made a beeline toward me. "What? Who has her?" she demanded to know. The rest of the parents and police stared at me with gazes that matched her words. So I composed myself once more and thought back in my mind as best I could, and started with the day I got off the bus and encountered the man who called himself Dave. I told them everything I could remember, starting with the description of Dave, how he tried to force his way into my home, how he made me feel, the symbol, the van, everything. Jessica went to go get snacks, and I saw his van drive onto my street. I knew he was back, so I went to warn her that she needed to get upstairs, but I was too late. I started to cry. He was already in the house, and he dragged her outside and into his van. "Please, I've told you everything I know about him. Please go and arrest him." Detective McKinley assured me that my description had already been forwarded to the station for a desk team to go through the database and look for suspects that match my description of the unsub, which they were calling White Van Man at this time. McKinley and a few of the uniformed officers went to go door to door to see if there were any witnesses of the abduction. A couple of family liaison officers came by to sit with us and try and comfort Jessica's parents. They were both really nice, a man and a woman, respectively. The man was a really young, soft-spoken individual who clearly had plenty of experience with traumatized children. He walked me and my parents through the process of this criminal investigation and what would likely follow tonight's initial inquiries. The other stayed with Jessica's parents, I imagine going over similar things. What happened next, I don't think anyone in the room expected, especially Detective McKinley. He'd come back after an hour of canvassing the surrounding neighborhoods for witnesses with a disappointed look on his face. No one in the area had seen anything, and the station had encountered some technical issues while trying to get back to him with an ID on White Van Man. Time was of the essence in these cases. His calming, confident detective routine had slipped, and he now had begun to grill me more like a man who was desperate for a win in a dwindling career. He had a frustrated and impatient tone to his questions now, and the wanting me calm approach was long gone. I could smell the booze on his breath when he yelled, too. I'd started to feel uncomfortable around him, and my mom felt it too. Things were about to get heated when they arrived. Two sharply dressed men, followed by a team in matching polo shirts, carrying technical equipment. They addressed themselves as the FBI. One of the agents, who was called Johnson, told McKinley that this case was under the jurisdiction of the Major Violent Crimes Department of the FBI, and the other, Agent Rodriguez, who was obviously second in command, told him that his officers were to debrief their team immediately and hand over all statements and progress reports and make their way back to their office for reassignment. McKinley was outraged. I didn't get why at the time. I just thought, hey, what's your problem, dude? You get to go home and chill in front of the TV. What are you moaning about? But I've seen enough police shows now to know this guy needed to prove his use, and likely his drinking had him on thin ice with his superiors. I learnt later on that he was being forced into early retirement after this assignment, and he wasn't being reassigned. I imagine he believed cracking a high-profile case like an abduction and the rescue of a white, upper-class family's only child may have saved his job. But I don't imagine he would have attended many AA meetings after this setback. He was a "this job is all I got" type of cop, was the impression I got. After McKinley and his team had left, the FBI tech team set up a listening and recording device on our landline phone, while the agents in charge studied my statement in grave detail before they both went out to the street to study the symbol at the foot of the drive. I managed to catch a glimpse. They had a look not that different from Dave's when he saw it, that blank, empty stare as if wishing it was literally anything but what they were actually looking at. I saw them instruct a few guys to take snaps of the drawing with a simple whistle and point, whilst they came back inside. They informed us that it was possible the kidnappers would make contact. They were right. At around 12:30, our landline rang. The agents signaled for my mom to answer the phone. My mom looked confused and asked why her, seeing as Jessica was the kidnapped victim, so likely her mom would be more susceptible to paying the ransom. Agent Johnson dismissed her question and told her it would be for her. At this point, I could tell my dad and Jessica's parents knew the agents knew something we didn't. The FBI were definitely keeping something from us. The tech activated the tape recorder and placed on a big set of headphones over his ears before nodding at Agent Rodriguez, who then gave my mom a similar cue to answer the phone. She picked up. "Hello?" my mom managed. At this stage, we couldn't hear the man on the other end of the phone, but I could just imagine Dave in his confident, glib tone. "Yes, this is she. How do you know my name?" She let the man talk for a minute or so. Her breathing started to increase rapidly as the man talked to her before she erupted. "You can go to hell, you psychopathic piece of shit. There is no way you are having my daughter." I had no idea what the man was saying, but it caused my mom to look Jessica's parents' way with a torn look on her face. "You monster. You won't get away with this. There is no way I'm handing my daughter over to you." Her voice rose from a quiver to a loud, angry crescendo. She slammed the receiver down and ran her hand through her hair and massaged her neck in one smooth, continuous motion. Now the phone call was over, she had started to avoid eye contact with Jessica's parents. Agent Johnson was asking the tech to try to run a trace on the call while my mom got her bearings together. Once she'd calmed down, she broke the news to Jessica's parents and my father about the contents of the call. I was right. Jessica was not the target of the kidnapping. I was. This person had been watching me for weeks and had tried to abduct me tonight, knowing my mom was not home. The only hiccup was they mistook Jessica for me. They were asking my mom to bring me to a designated location and have me traded for Jessica. We had 2 hours to bring me, or there would be consequences for Jessica and our families. As if sensing the eruption of emotion to come, Greg, the aforementioned male family liaison officer, took me out of the room and asked me to show him my bedroom so he could make sure it was safe. I knew this was some bullshit excuse to get me out of the room, so I didn't hear mine and Jessica's parents literally screaming at each other, arguing about whether my mom should be handing me over to these monsters. My mom told me days after that Jessica's mom had gone a little crazy, saying if it should have been me, then I should do the right thing and go, let Jessica come home, and then my mom would be wondering what those animals are doing to her little girl. Apparently, my mom slapped her and they got into it. Took a few agents to pull them apart by all accounts. I started to get upset the more I thought about the situation. Greg? Yes? Why me? I asked. Greg looked torn by my question and responded with, I'm sorry, Olivia. I can't say, unfortunately, but I have a feeling the agents will let everyone know what's going on real soon. Why not? I countered. Well, this is a very complicated situation, and let's just say that the law can be tricky at times. I can't say any more on it. I'm just here to make sure that you and your parents are okay. His responses generated more questions than answers, in all honesty, but I could tell I was backing him into a corner. I let him be, and we spent the next hour pulling my room back together while making sure there wasn't a boogeyman in my closet. Proverbial or actual. We waited for the animosity downstairs to calm down. The other FLO called us down after an hour, and I walked down my stairs to mine and Jessica's parents all sat on my couch with Agent Johnson stood up in front of them like a teacher in front of his students. I took a seat in between my parents, and they both looked down at me with a reassuring smile as if to tell me I wasn't going anywhere. They knew I'd likely heard the outburst from upstairs. Not that I ever thought my mom would agree to trade me. Nevertheless, I still appreciated it. Agent Johnson spoke. Okay, guys, what I'm about to tell you is strictly confidential. You are now part of one of the largest ongoing criminal investigations in North America. As he was talking, Agent Rodriguez handed out some documents. I'm going to need each of you to read and sign the bottom before I go any further. We all did without hesitation, but not without noting the section that stated if we breathed a word about this to anyone outside the FBI, that we would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. We didn't care, though. We just wanted to know what was going on. So who took Jessica? Was it the man who grabbed me last week? Was it Dave? I asked boldly. Agent Johnson didn't say a word. Instead, he continued looking at Agent Rodriguez, waiting for confirmation that we'd all sign the non-disclosure agreement. Rodriguez continued to review the paperwork while my dad blurted out a question. The police who were here before, their desk team or whatever, they were looking for someone. Have you had a lead? Rodriguez remained flicking through papers, and Johnson continued watching him. My mom backed up my dad's question with, yeah, they were. White van man. Who is he? You know, don't you? Finally, Rodriguez held the stack of papers in both hands and knocked them back into an even pile by firmly tapping the bottom of the NDA forms against his thighs 3 times before sliding them into a briefcase and locking it tight. He turned and nodded at Agent Johnson, who turned back to us to face us. White van men, plural, the agent said bluntly. He let what he had said sink in and used our stunned silence as an opportunity to continue his explanation. The people who we believe have Jessica are a large group of dangerous individuals that we have been chasing for a long time now.